I learned about the house on the drive back from the hospital. Considering that I was weak and half delirious with fever, it seemed an odd time to tell me about my birth parents' final gift. My grandparents were insistent. Maybe they figured that after such a close brush with death, there wasn't any time left to waste. I needed to know. My paternal grandparents had raised me. They were the first people I called when I began feeling sick. The fever lasted for days, followed by tremors and hellish, paralyzing night terrors. The doctor's tests were inconclusive, but after a while, my temperature finally began to drop on its own. It had been a close thing, and when I heard my grandparents' news, it was hard to believe that I wasn't still asleep and dreaming. According to them, I had inherited a house. We wanted to wait until the time was right, my grandparents explained. And now we think that it would be the perfect place for you to rest and recover your strength. Tired as I felt, I agreed with them. I didn't want to waste another minute. Fortunately, the house I'd inherited was just an hour away from the town where I'd grown up, at the end of a long gravel driveway. My parents' station wagon ground to a halt in front of a wrought iron gate. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a house. This was a mansion. A tanned, pudgy man in work attire ushered us through the gate with a wave of his hat. My grandparents rolled down their windows, talking to him like an old friend. His name was Paulo. He was the caretaker of the estate I'd inherited. With a short bow, he invited me inside. My grandparents said their goodbyes, assuring me that they'd be back to pick me up as soon as I felt better. The plume of dust that their car raised as it disappeared down the gravel road felt as unreal as everything else around me, and I pinched myself as Paulo led the way across the perfectly mowed green lawn. Paulo warned me not to get my hopes up. The house itself had been in my mother's family for generations, but for tax reasons, it was owned by a private trust. The place badly needed updating, but the trust prohibited all but the most superficial of renovations. Paulo's complaints and chatter faded into background noise as I walked through the double doors and took the place in. Ornate wood-paneled walls, mosaic floors, stained glass flowers, and the custom-built windows. I didn't understand. I'd always believed that my birth parents simply hadn't had the resources to raise me, but this place was clearly worth a fortune. Noticing my confusion, Paulo explained that a 19th century millionaire had built the place for my great-grandfather, Alexander, as a way of funding his research. Apparently my great-grandfather on my mother's side had been a sort of later-age Renaissance man. He'd owned almost nothing and lived on the patronage of the wealthy. Paulo's own great-grandfather, an illiterate Italian farmer, had been hired as a caretaker just 2 days after passing through Ellis Island, making the house as much a part of his family history as it was mine. I was winded by the time we arrived at the master suite. My sickness had taken more out of me than I thought. Seeing stars, I sat down on a real feather bed and looked out the window over the rolling hills, golden in the late afternoon sun. Smiling at my disbelief, Paulo reminded me that he'd be in the caretaker's cabin if I needed anything. The house was well provisioned, but if I had any requests for food and drink, he could pick it up when he went into town. Almost as an afterthought, he added that I should ignore any odd sounds that I might notice after dark. These old houses tend to creak and groan as they settled into their foundations, Paulo explained, and rats sometimes invaded the attic. In any case, it was best to just stay in bed if I heard anything. After Paulo left, I kicked off my shoes, stretched out, and stared up at the canopy of the four-poster bed. My mind buzzed with unanswered questions, but my body was utterly spent. Even though there were still hours left before nightfall, I sank into a deep and dreamless sleep. When I woke, the room was dark. I reached for a light switch. Nothing. Apparently electricity was one of the updates that the house so badly needed. The daylight coming through the window had been so bright before that I hadn't noticed it, but now I felt my way through the gloom of the bathroom. The house did have indoor plumbing, even though the toilet still flushed with an old-fashioned pull chain. I was just about to head back to bed when I heard footsteps in the hallway. My blood ran cold. This was no scurrying raccoon or creaking foundation. I pressed my ear to the door. The sound was soft, as though whoever was out there was barefoot, trying to keep quiet. The closest thing to a weapon in hand was a plunger. I grabbed it, I flung open the door, and the hallway was empty. I stood in the dark for a good while, listening, but heard no sound apart from the rustling leaves of the trees outside. On my way back to bed, I noticed another strange feature of the house. None of the doors had locks, or any other way to secure them shut. Despite their elaborate design, they were no different from the free-swinging doors of a hospital. I climbed nervously back into bed, unsure what my new discovery might mean. When I saw the room by the light of dawn a few hours later, I felt like a fool. It was true that there was no electricity in the house, but Paulo had left the battery-powered lantern right on my nightstand. Then, when I stumbled out into the hallway, I noticed the gentle tick of a grandfather clock downstairs. It seemed perfectly reasonable that my fever-addled brain had mistaken its echo for footsteps in the night before. Laughing to myself, I prepared myself some coffee and apple oatmeal in the well-stocked kitchen and set out to explore the house. My great-grandfather's patron had been generous. There was a library, a conservatory, and a vast, empty room that might have once been some kind of laboratory. The books lining the shelves were a testament to his varied interests. They ranged from Slavic folklore to advanced surgical techniques, and everything in between. It was, however, difficult to discover exactly what Alexander had been doing for his fabulously wealthy patron. Paulo's answer of all sorts of things wasn't exactly helpful, and the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed that I'd never heard of my great-grandfather or his research. Still, I hadn't come to my family home to exhaust myself with doubt. I was there to recover from my illness, and despite its mysteries, the estate seemed the perfect place to do so. Disconnecting from the digital world did me good, as did the fresh air and solitude. My grandparents had dropped off 2 suitcases of my clothes and personal belongings, while Paulo made sure the kitchen was well stocked with anything I happened to crave. Even so, I found myself eating and drinking less, instead spending more time walking, reading in the library, and investigating the strange old house that was my heritage. During the day, I felt like I was making progress. The nights, however, were a different story. Although it was probably nothing, I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps, the ones that I'd heard during my first night at the estate. The lack of lighting in the ornate, high-ceiling rooms bothered me, as did the fact that there was no way to lock any of the interior doors. The weirdly stretched shadows cast by my battery-powered lantern reminded me too much of the night terrors that accompanied my fever. And the worst of them, an emaciated woman in a white nightgown with hollow eyes and distended jaw that hung down to her chest and pursued me through the darkened corridors. Corridors that didn't seem very different from those of the estate. Maybe it was superstition. Maybe it was just a gut feeling. But I dragged a heavy armchair in front of my door before I went to bed. On the third night, a heavy thump jarred me out of my sleep. I rushed to investigate, then cursed when my big toe collided with a chair that I'd placed in front of the door. The chair was undisturbed, so whatever had caused the sound must have come from somewhere else in the house. The adjacent rooms were empty, and below me was only the library. Lantern in hand, I hurried down the stairs and into the cavernous room. Nothing seemed amiss, but as I ran my hand along the endless rows of musty books, a thought occurred to me. Wasn't it possible that The eccentric millionaire who'd built this place for my great-grandfather had included some equally eccentric features in its design. A secret passage, for example. It sounded absurd, but when I inspected the shelves more closely, I realized that one stood slightly higher above the floor than the others. The mechanism was simple, built into the side of the bookcase. It was hardly secret at all. A gentle tug released the latch and the bookcase swung onward. When I lifted my electric lantern into the darkness on the other side, I realized that it wasn't a passage at all. It was a room. Roughly the size of a closet, it contained a wing-back chair, an oil lamp, and a series of journals ordered by date. Mesmerized, I took one down and began to leaf through it. It appeared to contain my great-grandfather's notes on some sort of project. Test subject identification numbers, age, height, calories ingested. I noticed that the number in the height column steadily increased, while those in the calories ingested column decreased, in some cases to 0. The subjects who didn't reach 0 were crossed off with an X. I wondered if they'd dropped out of the tests early or something. Hours later, I'd gone through 4 of those weird journals and was still no closer to understanding what my great-grandfather had been trying to do. Some of the pages featured sketches of bizarre machines. Others showed dosage charts or occult symbols. I was just about to give up and go back to bed when I noticed the darker-than-dark shadow watching me from the doorway of the hidden room. And whatever it was tall, and just beyond the reach of my tiny lantern's glow. I could vaguely discern the outline of long, stringy hair in an old-fashioned nightgown. If I held up my light. What else would I see? Sunken eyes? Hungry, distended jaws? For a long time, neither of us moved. And then the door slammed shut. That's how I learned that at least one room in the house did lock. From the outside. Hyperventilating, I looked around the tiny space. There was no way out, and I began to suspect that whatever this place's original purpose had been, it hadn't been used for a study. It had seemed so cozy that I hadn't noticed the smooth, soundproof walls or the drain in the concrete floor. It felt like a place where people had been kept against their will. And now here I was, trapped just as they had been. I pounded on the bookshelf door, screaming until my throat was hoarse. Soon I was leaning dizzily against the wall, wondering why my feet looked blurry. I was going to pass out. The sight of a pedal on the floor jolted me out of my panic. Of course, whoever had remodeled the room must have changed the locking mechanism as well. When I leaned my weight against the pedal, the door swung open easily. I tumbled, panting, into the library. I was surprised to see that the sun had come up and that Paula was leaning against the banister shouting my name. The caretaker claimed to have no knowledge of the hidden room, but he didn't seem very surprised to see me come staggering out of the wall either. Old houses have a lot of secrets. Paula shrugged, before asking me if there was anything I wanted from town. I considered asking about the tall, tangled-haired figure in the nightdress, but the last thing I wanted was for him to fear for my sanity. I reminded myself that I had experienced strangely similar hallucinations during my sickness. It was still a very long way from a complete recovery. Besides, if the gaunt woman had been real, then where had she gone? I had no appetite for breakfast. Instead, I made several loops around the exterior of the house, trying to create a mental map of its windows, chimneys, and cellars. Just as I'd suspected, many of the rooms were much smaller inside than they should have been. It's like there was a whole separate house in the dead space between the walls. The strange soundproof room that I discovered had been easy enough to access, but there was no clear way into the other spaces between the walls. For a crazy moment, I even considered smashing a hole into the plaster, but then I remembered the mysterious trust that managed the estate. If I damaged the property, I would surely be sued, banned from ever returning, or worse. My head ached. The bright sunlight was starting to get to me. I investigated the cellar, where I didn't find much more than old gardening equipment. Dozens more of the small, thick-walled rooms, just as empty and mysterious as the one upstairs. By mid-afternoon, Paolo still hadn't returned, and he wasn't back by sundown. I began to feel genuinely concerned, and not only for the kindly old caretaker's health. Without Paolo's car and phone, I had no way off the estate. Still weak from the sickness, just a few loops around the house were enough to wear me out. There was no way I could walk the length of the 2-mile driveway that led to the main road. Even worse, Paolo's absence meant that for the first time, I'd be truly alone in the house after dark. And who knew what might come creeping out of the walls? With a deep breath, I sat down on my bed, wondering what I should do. Twilight had descended on the estate, and at first, I didn't even see the large leather-bound album on the mattress beside me. I hadn't put it there. In fact, I'd never seen it before in my life. Paolo couldn't have placed it there either. I glanced up, half expecting to find some horrible, less-than-human thing standing close enough to touch. But the room was empty. Running my fingertips over the old leather, I wondered what the album was meant to tell me. There was a small black-and-white photo of a family of 5 in the center of its cover. I clearly recognized my own green eyes, sharp cheeks, frizzy brown hair, and their features. Fascinated, I opened up to the first page. Although our patron has been most generous in providing test subjects, the gift of immortality is not one to be bestowed casually. Within these pages, I'll document my family's journey into the next phase of human evolution. Alexander T. If the journals had sounded insane, the album's dedication was even more so, especially considering the first few pages. They featured nothing more than the same 5 people going about their daily lives, sharing a meal, reading in the library, and even lined up by height in the main hallway. After the 9th page, however, things began to change. The meals, I realized, were being documented because the people in the photos were being fed some kind of chemical. The dosages were listed across from each photo. The library photos were taken with increasingly less illumination, probably to show that for the people in the photo, light was increasingly unnecessary. Likewise, the height images were used to show that the family's bodies were changing far more rapidly than should have been normal. The changes were more obvious in the adults. Their arms and legs became stretched and gaunt, their eyes hollow, their heads grew larger, and their jaws dropped ever lower towards their chests. In the meal photos, I noticed that quantities of food and drink were becoming less and less. By the 15th page, the family wasn't eating at all. The family photos became nothing more than black, lightless squares, and the hallway height photos were almost too gruesome to look at. The children continued to look normal, which in many ways was worse. For them, living with these emaciated, inhuman things was normal. I hoped they were costumes. I hoped it was a prank, a joke, anything. There were no more photos until the children reached young adulthood. Then came another series of charts: height, weight, food consumption, and fever. In the next photos, a few barely perceptible changes had already taken place, and more importantly, there were new additions to the family. Each of the original children now had a spouse and a child of their own. Those 3 relationships seemed too close to be a coincidence, and a chilling thought occurred to me. Had the children been ordered to find partners, to breed the next generation before they themselves began to change? The background of the following images was slightly more modern. Bushy facial hair, corsets were out, tuxedos and flapper dresses were in. Behind those superficial differences, however, was a sinister repeat of the first set of photos. The adults grew even more monstrous. The children were mostly unchanged until another set of charts. The third generation had reached adolescence, and by now, the photos were in color. Beneath them, however, were the same measurements: height, weight, food consumption, and fever. This generation, too, had found partners and had children of their own. One of those children was my mother. I almost didn't want to turn the page. I already knew what was next. The older generation would warp and change, finally retreating into the other side of the house. The younger generation would find partners, reproduce, then gradually begin to change themselves. My father, it seemed, had hid me from my mother's family by taking me to my grandparents. He had broken the cycle. Hadn't he? I thought about the fever, the lack of appetite, headaches caused by the sunlight. And I started to wonder, what if my grandparents hadn't brought me out here to recover? What if they'd brought me here because it was already too late? What if I'd been allowed to discover the secret rooms, the photo album, and my great-grandfather's work, all in order to introduce me to the changes I'd soon be experiencing myself? The footsteps I'd heard and the figures I'd seen were my own family within the walls, coming to check up on me to see how I was progressing. I looked down at my fingers. Weren't they a bit longer and thinner than they'd been this morning? My heart raced at a sudden creaking sound from the bedroom wall. It was swinging outward. The blackness beyond beckoned. My heritage. My future. An eternity of lightless passages. Come to us, my mother whispered from the darkness. We're waiting. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I want to tell you thank you so much for watching tonight's video. I want to give a huge thank you to everybody who supports me on Patreon. This past year has been rough. I've been gone for quite a while trying to get things organized for my own life, and Patreon subscribers, you guys who subscribe everywhere, this has kept me afloat in turbulent waters. So I want to give a very special thank you to Jordan Humble, Diana Kraus, Disciple, Strategy Wolf Emoji, SullyMan, Brandon Mendoza, BrimstonePandemonium, Caltuna, William Wellington, Scruffy the Janitor, Brenna LaQueda Canizales, Smiley the Psychotic, Djenna, Dante Kinkade, SimbasBloodyMojo, Mephistopheles, CursepoxPrimarch, M. Jesus Cornejo, Yarghoul, VerbalHorror, Amber Clark, J. Kearns, Mike, himbojerry, CrusaderChocobo, Corbin Dallas, Estebean, Seclude, Salty Surprise, Red Shadowcat, Turtleman, Cryolinian, Mr. Marcus Blitz, Dirt Diver 030, Voice of Sand, Psychomel, Melted Lake, Tali Sue, William King, Sashi Suzaku, Croconut 509, Stricken, Freddy Krueger, Hades Nephew, Acid System, Sky Harbor, Nico Kyle, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, and Corey Kenshin. To all you guys and everybody who's included in the description down below, thank you so much for everything that you guys have done for me, and thank you so much for being here when times get difficult and I can't always be around to make content. I really appreciate your support, and I cannot thank you enough. And that goes to everybody who watches these videos, that goes to everybody who's subbed here, and anybody who has ever liked a creepypasta story ever. I wish you all the best. Sweet dreams.